So, Liesbeth, welcome, and please introduce yourself and tell us how you became involved in the work of de-radicalization and rehabilitation.
Yes, well, first of all, thank you very much for having me on this podcast. I've been working with both CEP, the Confederation of European Probation, as well as with RAND before, but this is a premiere for me as well, doing a vodcast, and I really like that you're doing this and think it's really helpful also to allow practitioners to actually watch something rather than just listen to podcasts. So thanks for having me. About myself, well, as you mentioned, I'm Liesbeth van der Heide. I work in the Netherlands, have been working in the Netherlands for the past 10 to 11 years now. I started working in 2011, so the year that basically many countries and governments were shocked by the onset of the Arab Spring and people who started to travel to Syria and Iraq. So my career coincided, or the start of my career coincided with the foreign fighter phenomenon. And when everyone around me started to focus on, hey, who are these people? Why are they traveling? Why does it feel like jihadism is suddenly back in town or back in countries? Instead, I was doing research on lone wolf terrorism in the Netherlands, and one of the questions that came out of that research is we have a couple of lone wolves in prison, or we had them back in 2011, and they were going to come out. So the question became, what do we do when it comes to rehabilitating these people? So the start of my career, as I said, coincided with the foreign fighter phenomenon, but rather than focusing on that, I started focusing on the question in the Netherlands, what do we do with terrorists that come out of prison? And back then that was kind of like a minor topic, but yeah, the topic of rehabilitation and reintegration, R&R as it's often dubbed in the international context, has gotten more and more attention for very obvious reasons, including the number of people that have come back from Syria and Iraq, the rise of people incarcerated, imprisoned for terrorism across the globe. All of that has led to the question, and now what do we do now that we have them in prisons and post-prison? That's a tough question, because I remember writing my first papers and articles on this topic, and then I had this catchphrase that I could just copy-paste into any new written piece that was, the field of rehabilitation and reintegration research is still in its infancy. And then I would quote a couple of others who were saying the same thing. And I think on the one hand, we can say that we've definitely progressed a lot, especially in the last 5 years. When it comes to studies on specific rehabilitation reintegration programs. So you could say there's been a clear rise in case studies. At the same time, there's always that underlying million-dollar question, the question of what really works in rehabilitating terrorist individuals. And most people, including I think the general audience, will automatically translate that question into how do you de-radicalize individuals? And unfortunately, I think when it comes to that specific question, and especially the role of ideology, what ideology even is, and what it means to de-radicalize, and if it's even possible, I think on that question we still have a long way to go. It is a much more difficult question, so I think there's a lot more data available right now and a lot more information about what different countries are doing. But on that specific question of what works, what is effective, and what does that even mean, I think we're still in the, not the infancy phase, but more in the brainstorming phase, it seems to me, because there's been many pieces written, but more like think pieces on how to conceptualize ideology. Is de-radicalization even possible? Is it something we should even strive for as a government, for example? But yeah, any studies showing whether it works and how. Still waiting for that. And one of the questions is that even worth waiting for, or is that just a question that we're never going to be able to answer? Yeah. Well, I think there's a couple of very generic lessons learned that you see popping up everywhere as well. Let me just emphasize 3 different ones. The first one almost sounds a bit cliche, but is always, again, important to emphasize, and that's what's often named a multi-actor approach, but I would make it more specific when you talk about professionals, and I myself being a practitioner, I would translate that into make sure you've got both professionals with a focus on security and professionals who focus on the healthcare side of things at the table. And I think many countries have that, but I still think in practice, there's still a long way to go in sitting down with these people, bringing these people at the table. That's usually happening, but then trying to really get a sense of, if you're a police officer, what does it mean if I am working at the municipality level? Because then we might have very different goals with one individual. And again, if I have someone at the table and we're all discussing the same person, but you are working on behalf of the Council for Childcare Protection because returning minors are involved, you again might have very different ideas of about what is necessary and what is possible and what is in the interest of the child. And if I have a psychiatrist at the table, he has very different ideas on what the impact might be of ideology, or might not even find that something to take into account. It takes more than just sitting together at the table. So I think that would be number one. Number two would be that this is something, the whole issue of rehabilitation and reintegration, I think we've clearly seen. You can't just say, okay, we have now an individual or a group and we have a plan of action, we're going to go implement it, and basically someone's going to go through that plan, kind of like a washing machine, and they'll come out at some point cleansed and refreshed and can be put back into society. I think we have learned partially through failure that we have to be very realistic when it comes to what we can achieve with this group and where the role of government agencies also should end. And so I think for a much larger number than we kind of hoped for maybe in the very beginning, we're going to have to conclude that a lot of individuals are just going to have major vulnerabilities in their lives that will persist throughout their lives, and that we cannot simply fix people through some kind of washing machine. And the third one, a bit a controversial one maybe, but when I started out with my own research, I found that many countries, governments, organizations were kind of steering away from the ideological part and saying we should focus on disengagement. Governments aren't thought police. You have freedom in what you believe in, even if you believe in very weird or maybe even extremist things. And we cannot even control someone's thoughts. So for all those reasons, we should focus on behavior and trying to prevent violent behavior. At the same time, through all of my work, both in prisons, in practice, but also through my academic work, to me it became more and more obvious that we simply cannot afford to ignore the ideological part, even if we don't agree on what it is, how it manifests itself, and the fact that ideologies change sometimes on a weekly basis. But yeah, so my third lesson, and I think half of the people you might talk to might agree and the other half might not, but that's what we love about this field as well, I think. But yeah, that ideology, you need to take ideology into account when it comes to rehabilitating individuals. You can kind of categorize them always into 5 different categories, which is educational interventions, job-related, vocational skill type interventions. That's the second category. The third category is psychological or psychiatrist interventions. The fourth category is religious interventions. And the fifth category is, I called it the recreational interventions, and that was kind of like a mixed bag, because some programs do art therapy or they do anger management training through engaging in sports activities, for example. So it's everything kind of like in the recreational sphere, but with the aim to attain certain goals related to rehabilitation. So that's just to give a bit of background, because I looked at many different programs, and if you ask what really works, or what did I find people who were doing those programs found very effective. I think the funny thing is it doesn't really lie in one of these categories. So it's not really that you can say, well, education overall really works when it comes to rehabilitating, but the most important thing was the attitude of the individuals conducting the interventions with the person, both in and after prison. The trust relationship that an individual, a coach, a case manager within prison, a probation worker after prison, the trust relationship that they have or try to build, that's the most important independent variable, I would say, for what happens in a person's life in the field of rehabilitation, because I think that's kind of like the underlying factor that might provide people who are only often participating in programs mandatorily because they have to, with the first trigger, you could say, to become intrinsically motivated, just because someone else wants you to care about these things. And I also found in different countries that, for example, it's very important in that sense to evaluate what the relationship is between the one conducting a program or doing interventions and the individual it concerns. And that's easier said than done, because in some countries, including in the Netherlands, that is taken into account. And sometimes practitioners also conclude, I just do not have it with this person. We just don't connect, we don't click. Sometimes even, I feel like this person has contempt for me. Sometimes that's related to the ideology. Sometimes it has to do with jihadi individuals not wanting to sit down and talk to women, for example, or sometimes it has to do with, here in the Netherlands we have one Dutch guy with a migrant background working as a probationer, and he had a very difficult time to connect with a right-wing extremist who is against all migrants coming to Europe, so to speak. So for many reasons, but often it's much more intangible. It's much more personality. Some people can just get through and others cannot. So that's not even a specific intervention, but basically kind of like the number one fundament that you need to build rehabilitation from. So the trust building aspect, on the one hand, everyone again would say, well, okay, rather easy, right? You sit down with a person and it's partially a time dependent variable. The more time you spend with someone one-on-one, talking to them, getting to know them. But then again, as I said, you can sit down as often as you want with a person. There's often something intangible about whether you get through to a person or not. And I'd say that's almost similar to any one of us making friends. You just have them for some reason and you click with some people better than you do with others. So I think that building that trust relationship means you need to be very reflective on whether you think that's getting built or not. And if not, I think also quite early on in the rehabilitation process, you should say, look, I don't think I'm going to be able to build that trust relationship with this particular person. And you might not even know exactly why, but I do think most professionals working in this field would know whether it's working or not, whether they have that click. After that, there's a couple of other things that are very important. Well, just to mention one, transparency. And again, you would say, well, obviously transparency in a trust relationship, quite essential, but that's often very difficult with this particular group of offenders, because overall, professionals working one-on-one with individuals with a terrorist background often have numerous other colleagues and institutes and organizations that they need to report to, that they might need to share information with. And what I think many practitioners know is how difficult it is to find that balance between, on the one hand, being very open and transparent about everything with the person you're building that relationship with, while at the same time being open and transparent to your partners. And there's always going to be a trade-off there, because on the one hand, it's very important to make very clear at the outset of any program to the person it concerns to say, look, if I really worry about something that you're going to be telling me over the coming weeks or years, maybe even if I think, well, I see a very clear security risk, maybe I'm going to have to report that. You need to be very clear about kind of like the framework within which these conversations are going to take place. But also, and that's something we often struggle with, what if a person tells you something about their ideology, their family background, or about the offense they have committed? And this happens very often. Probationers, coaches, sometimes NGOs working with these individuals are very able to build that trust relationship, but then often hear things that they might feel, intelligence services would be very interested in this information, or maybe even should I or should I not report this to the police, or I also have a role in advising the criminal justice system. How do I deal with this piece of information? So I think transparency is essential, and I think all too often practitioners, especially on the security side of things, are a bit scared of transparency. They very much have the idea that as soon as you tell someone anything, they will not talk to you anymore. Whereas I found the opposite often, that if you have built that relationship, it's surprising how much transparency also the people it concerns can often take. And if you can explain it well, they often understand it very well as well. We have that with returning women, where as the municipality, we also say, look, in the end, we can offer you a lot, but the reason that you're in this approach is because you are a returnee from Syria and Iraq, and because there's a court case going on. So let's be clear, we're going to be getting a lot of questions from security partners, and we will be discussing everything with you, and it's up to you what you do and do not disclose. And often you find that over time, people will start disclosing pretty much everything, and, the size of their shoes, so to speak. But you need to be very clear about that at the onset and also throughout the process. And even if you feel like you're facing dilemmas in what to share with these individuals, even that I think you need to discuss, because often, especially with terrorists, they already have a distrust against the government. And for some funny reason, after a while, if you build a trust relationship, they often don't see government officials anymore as part of the government. So there's this cognitive dissonance, but you need to be very careful with that trust, and also be explicit about transparency and about dilemmas you might have about that. For any Dutch viewers, obviously the Dutch approach. No, kidding aside, I think we evaluated quite stringently the Dutch approach, and that especially when it comes to that trust building relationship, they are doing a very good job at it when it comes to the R&R program. At the same time, we also have our own clear question marks or things for improvement. One very clear one being, what do we even mean by reintegration? Quite central, you could say, but we got very many different answers to that question, even from people in the same team or people tasked with reintegration. So that's, I think, a quite important lesson to learn still. Some other very successful parts of programs, one in the Philippines. In the Philippines, it's mainly the southern parts of the country that are faced with large-scale terrorism. And there was a big prison in Davao City, and there's a lot of banana plantations in the south of the Philippines as well. And they had set up, and that's partially something we were working on as well, a big work program for terrorist prisoners. Well, for one thing, there were thousands of terrorist prisoners housed in that particular prison. And I've often found in the prison reality, the biggest issue is boredom, especially for terrorist prisoners, because they're always high security, on the high security level. And many people get quite uncomfortable when you think about what could you allow these prisoners to do. Whereas if you focus on any generic programs for prisoners, everyone knows and understands, and that's been researched, how important it is to have education or a job if you come out of prison. So there they were able to set up together with the local municipalities. It's kind of like a mayor type function, but there they call it barangays. And then they said, okay, we should kind of say who's coming from your particular village and what type of work could they do. And then there were a couple of big banana plantation owners, and they set up some kind of work scheme where terrorist prisoners could work 5 days a week, part-time, like half days, guarded. So that also took some investment. But at the same time, they were paying minimum wages. And there's always a big debate to be had about, because I've also visited Colorado, and in Colorado there's a city called Canyon City, and they call it the correctional capital of the world because it has 7 correctional institutes, and they have literally a big company that's called Colorado Correctional Industries. Well, it's called Industries for a reason, because they showed me around their rehabilitation programs, and I felt like I was in an IKEA. and they had an entire buffalo farm for farming buffaloes for producing mozzarella, I think. And they had the largest factory producing license plates for cars, all being run based on the work of prisoners. But I found some pretty damning articles in the US news that it's basically a modern form of slavery if you look at what these prisoners get paid. So that's a discussion to be had. And even then, I still think it's much better for prisoners generally, and especially also terrorist prisoners, to have something to do and to participate in those types of work programs.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Liesbeth. It was very informative and hopefully very useful for the practitioners in particular.